Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we're continuing on in Genesis chapter 33. So I'm going to read the whole chapter and we'll get started today. Jacob looked up and there was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Then Esau looked up and saw the women and children. "Who are these with you?" he asked. Jacob answered, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Then the female servants and their children approached and bowed down. Next, Leah and her children came and bowed down. Last of all came Joseph and Rachel, and they too bowed down. Esau asked, "What's the meaning of all these flocks and herds I met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Esau said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. Then Esau said, "Let us be on our way. I'll accompany you." But Jacob said to him, "My lord knows that the children are tender, and that I must care for the ewes and cows that are nursing their young. If they are driven hard just one day, all the animals will die. So let my lord go on ahead of his servant, while I move along slowly, at the pace of the flocks and herds before me, and the pace of the children, until I come to my lord and seer." Esau said, "Then let me leave some of my men with you." "But why do that?" Jacob asked. "Just let me find favor in the eyes of my lord." So that day Esau started on his way back to Seir. Jacob, however, went to Succoth, where he built a place for himself and made shelters for his livestock. That is why the place is called Succoth. After Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. There he set up an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. So we have here in this chapter, we finally have the confrontation that we've been building up for weeks. We finally have Jacob meeting Esau. And while it went well in this chapter, we know that Jacob was concerned. He was worried about this encounter with Esau. Because if we remember back to the beginning of the story of Jacob and Esau, Jacob took the birthright and the blessing from his brother Esau. He acted very deceptively, and he took the things that belonged to Esau. And yet God had mercy on him, and he called him to his purpose to be the father of many nations, just like he had called Abraham and Isaac. And now it was coming to Jacob. He was going to inherit this Abrahamic blessing that was originally given to Abraham, and it was being passed down, that they were going to be a great nation, that they were going to have all these blessings from God, and that eventually the entire world was going to be blessed because of these patriarchs, these men. And so God called him to his purpose and had him go through all this training period with Laban, and he had to go through some very difficult times where he was tricked and cheated and he had hardships, and God prepared him carefully along the way, preparing him to go back and face his fears, preparing him to go back and face his past. And so in this chapter we finally have it. The past couple of weeks we've been talking about him starting to go back, his decision to listen to the Lord as he was called back home, his conversation with his wives, and then we had some different encounters along the way when he had to deal with things with Laban because he didn't leave him on the best of terms, and they had to make a treaty and a peace covenant. And then we saw that he sent all these animals on ahead to try to win the favor and to be pleasing in the sight of his brother Esau. And finally, in this chapter, we have the great confrontation. But it goes very differently than Jacob had thought it would. It goes very differently than what he had feared would happen. While we know that he was afraid of what his brother might do after all these years of hating him and trying to kill him, after all these years we see that Esau seems to be a different person as well. Not just Jacob. We know that Jacob has been on this transformation path, as we just talked about. God has been working in his life. But it seems that Esau has had at least somewhat of a similar journey where he is a different man, because he does not come out and meet his brother in a confrontation type of way. Instead, he meets him in a loving way. He ran out to meet Jacob, embraced him, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him, it says in verse 4. So we see that he comes out in a very different way than Jacob had anticipated. He may have anticipated that it was going to go very poorly, that his brother would be angry, that it wouldn't go so well. But yet, that was not what he found out. He found out that God was blessing him with a much different encounter than he had expected. Instead of anger and hatred and disunity and division, he was met with kindness, love, mercy, and a reuniting of brothers. And so this is a great moment. This is a huge culmination point in this story because we've been building up to it for weeks and weeks. And here we finally get to see how God is doing something in this story, how he's bringing these two back together in this story. And there's going to be a new part of the story to come forward, something different. It's not going to be like it was in the past because God is always working on something new. He makes new things out of the old things, out of the chaos that was in Jacob's past. He was able to bring about this great reunion, this great peace between the brothers. And so we see that here in this chapter. And then we see that Esau sees all the women and children. He asks what's going on, and Jacob answers, "They're the children God has graciously given your servant." And he keeps pointing, Jacob does, in this chapter, to God's incredible blessing, to what God had done for him, and how gracious God had been toward him. He knew what he had done in his past. He knew the division he had caused in the family, the chaos he had thrown his parents and brother into, and all that he had stolen from his brother. He knew what he had done in his past, and that he had to run away from that, and that he had not left on great terms. He knew what was in his past, and he realized that God had been gracious toward him, that he had shown him mercy and kindness that he did not deserve, just like God has shown to you and I. God gives us grace and mercy when we are on the run from our past, when we're on the run and out of control because we have done things that we can't fix. We each do things on a day-to-day basis that gets us away from God, that gets us away from relationships with other people, just like with Jacob and Esau, and it creates problems. Yet God has mercy on us. He has compassion through Jesus Christ and love, great love for us, just as he did for Jacob and Esau. And he has a plan for our lives, just as we have seen with Jacob's. So we can take confidence when we look at this story and see how God was working all throughout the story of Jacob, all throughout the story of Esau, for this moment and for the moments that are going to come after. We see the incredible hand of God moving, even though human beings are continually messing it up, just like you and I do on a day-to-day basis. But not only does Jacob continually point to what God has graciously given him in this chapter, but he seeks to make at least something right with his brother. While he cannot go back and give back the birthright and the blessing and all those things that he had taken from his brother in the past, he can, in this chapter, do something, and he does. He chooses to give all these animals to his brother as a kind of peace offering, as a form of restitution, if you will, not just to please him, but maybe to pay it back, maybe to say, I know what I've taken from you. Here's what I'm going to give you in return. I realize what I've done. Here's what I'm going to do to try to make things right. So whatever his motivation was, it certainly seems that at least factored into it, that he realized he needed to do this. Because when we see that Esau initially says, I already have plenty, my brother, keep what you have for yourself, in verse 9, we see that there is a very animated reaction from Jacob. No, please, if I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that I brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need. And it says that because he insisted, Esau then accepted it. So we see that he is very eager for his brother to take these, even though he could have just said, well, that's great. He doesn't want these. I will just take all these animals for myself and be really, really rich. But he realizes he needs to do this. This is something he felt he had to do, maybe to make up for what he had done in the past, or whatever it may be. He definitely seems to have gotten a little bit smarter and realized that he needs to make things right when he goes astray in his life. And we see that he's really grown from the last time he had seen his brother. And so that's interesting to see in this chapter. He realized what he had done in the past. He makes restitution for that and tries to make up for it in the present. And that's a great way for us to look at things in our lives, when we can learn from our mistakes, realize that we have wronged people, and try to make things right. We can't always make everything go back to the way it was. We can't always make everything perfect. We certainly can't do that on our own. But through Jesus, through God's strength, we can make certain things right. We can go back to people and say, I'm sorry. Please accept my apology. Please accept what I'm going to try to do to make things right. I'm changing. I'm a changed person. And that really, to me, is what Jacob is doing in this section. He is a changed man. He still has his faults. We know that he still continues to have some struggles with deception. He still has some struggles in his life, but yet he is a different man. He is relying on God rather than always relying on his own strength. And he's not always perfect about that, just like you and I aren't, but he is trying and striving to follow God and less of the time is he following himself. And that's what we should be doing on a day-to-day basis in our own lives. We should be relying less and less on our own strength and more each day on God's strength. We should be trying to fail less in the areas that we know are our weak areas, and we should be trying to do and be obedient to what God has called us to do. And just like Jacob is trying to do, he's not perfect by any means, but he's trying to do what God has called him to do. He's trying to live according to the blessing that God has given him and called him to be a part of, and he's trying to live in obedience to the Lord. And that's a key thing that we need to see for our own lives. The obedience to the Lord is so important. And it leads to moments like this, when we decide to change in our lives, when we decide to seek the Lord, to follow after him, when we go through moments like Jacob went through, and processes where God changes our hearts, changes our lives, changes the direction of our life, then it leads to moments like this where we see peace and we see success and blessing in this chapter. We see God go above and beyond and make a great way for there to be a great moment between these brothers. And it only comes about as a result of the process that Jacob had to go through and a result of his changes and the changes that God worked through him. So we see this great culminating moment in this chapter. And then towards the end of the chapter, we see that Jacob wants to go at a slower pace. He's not going to go very quickly and go back to his family right away. He's not going to have this great kumbaya moment where everything's just going to be great and it's all going to go back to the way it was. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be just an instantaneous fix of all the families going to be back together again as one big unit. It's not going to be like that because, as we said earlier, we can't always fix everything. We can't go back always to the way it was. God calls us to something new. That doesn't mean that we don't get stuff restored, like in this chapter where the brothers are restored to each other, but things are going to be different. They're not going to immediately go back to the way they were years before, or even decades before in some cases in our own lives. So we need to see that and realize that God has called us to different things, to new things, just as he's calling Jacob to in this chapter. Well, I hope you've been challenged by this chapter and that you'll join us next week as we move on to Genesis chapter 34 and get onto a very different tone, a very different story. So we'll look forward to that, of Dinah and the Shechemites, next week. Another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking.